Imbalance IT Solutions provides a unique consulting approach to transform your organization's data, cybersecurity, and hybrid cloud environments. We would like to welcome you to our podcast series we call The Balancing Act, discussing complex digital transformation. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hello, listeners out there. This is Ryan O'Halloran, VP of Security Strategy here at Imbalance IT, bringing you episode 3 of the Balancing Act podcast series. Today, we're going to be discussing modernizing hybrid Active Directory security and recovery. And I have with me special guest Sean Deuby. Sean, how are you?
Good.
Sean, great to have you on. I'm excited to share what we have to talk about today with our listeners. Sean is the principal technologist of North America at Semperis, which is the most advanced hybrid AD visualization, protection, and recovery solution on the market. So Sean, again, good afternoon. Thanks for joining me. I figure we could start out with you just telling us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then the mission of Semperis as an organization.
Sure. Thanks, Ryan. And thanks for having me. I like to say when introducing myself, a good summary sometimes is I like to say I've been doing Microsoft identity as long as Microsoft has been doing identity. So it goes way, way back. And I won't say how far back, but it's been a long, long time for Texas Instruments and Intel. I was one of the original architects of Intel's Active Directory and then ran it for 10 years. And then I've gone off and done consulting, as a technology journalist, writing about the origins of hybrid identity when it was still brand new and nobody really thought about it, to writing about Azure Active Directory, now Entra ID, as a technology journalist, and then as a consultant. And I've sort of gone full circle in my career, and I'm back to Active Directory with Semperis because of the critical importance that it still has in just about every organization, and the risks it poses by threat actors right now for both, on-premises ID, Active Directory, and as it has evolved, as you say, hybrid identity, which is Active Directory and Entra ID. And I was a Microsoft MVP for essentially identity for 15 years as well. Now, as far as Semperis goes, Semperis, the company, is focused on a category that has since become recognized just recently as identity threat detection and response. So Semperis is all about protecting hybrid identity, giving you operational resilience to your critical component of your security architecture and indeed of your whole company for both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, Entra ID, to provide operational resilience and recovery in this world where identity is attacked all the time.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because a lot of times people, they always talk about phishing and they always talk about these types of things, but not necessarily do we correlate that with what it is. It's an attack on an identity, right? And today, identity is really viewed as the new perimeter. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about that? Why that is the perimeter now as opposed to your firewall and why that's important?
Sure. I think that by now most people have heard the drumbeat of identity is the new perimeter. That's been going around for a long time. But essentially what it means is that you can no longer count on the corporate network to be a secure location. And that is where you get the phrase assume breach, for the way you assume that your network perimeter is no longer secure. And we've actually, we published a ransomware survey of, I think it was 900 companies recently, and judging as a result of looking at what has come out of that survey, we've really updated that to call it assume constant breach. The threat actors are always attacking, and they may be in there all the time. And part of the challenge, of course, is that you don't know. So what it comes down to, and we have users, and our own company is A great example of it, we have users everywhere, in home offices, in regular offices, on the road, in airplanes, on mobile devices, on laptops, all sorts of endpoints in all sorts of locations. So network doesn't really enter into it anymore because the network can be anywhere. So what that means is, how do you secure it? And this is sort of where the old zero trust comes into play. And I'd like to say for about zero trust is that if you have trouble sleeping at night, you could pull up the NIST document called Implementing a Zero Trust Architecture. And NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is the technology and standards arm of the federal government. And pretty much everybody inside and outside the government follows what NIST has to say, or at least a variation of it. And in the document Implementing a Zero Trust Architecture, NIST itself says that enhanced identity governance, they say EIG, and what that really means is, that means your identity systems with governance wrapped around it. Account creation, deletion, tracking, all of this, good governance around it. Enhanced identity governance is seen as the foundational component of zero trust architecture. There are other very important components of zero trust architecture, don't get me wrong, but NIST itself says that identity is the foundational component. So that means that several aspects of identity, of course, identities getting out and being stolen and all that is one aspect of it, but the other aspect of it is the systems that manage identity, and that pretty much everything else on the network and in your organization rely on to secure access. So it really becomes identity, access control, and resource. And if identity is compromised, as our CEO likes to say, if the threat actors have compromised the identity system, they can masquerade as anybody. They can masquerade as him. They can masquerade as a senior IT person and get access to whatever they want. So identity has become the fundamental component of the modern security architecture, essentially.
I love that, because I'm constantly, when I'm consulting with our customers here at Imbalance, I get that question, right? Where do I start in the zero trust journey? And I always say the exact same thing. And obviously NIST says that too, so that's important. But secure your identities, and sorry, and one of the things I think about that too that gets lost is when folks think about identities, they think about humans with heartbeats. And there's also the non-human side. There's
Right.
APIs, there's service accounts, there's all these things that don't have identity assurance or not responding to MFA, but they need that same level of discovery, that same level of governance, that same level of assurance, right? And then a reduction of blast radius. And the idea of doing that, even when I hear people say micro segmentation, it's almost like they're talking about network inherently. Well, there's micro-segmentation of identities too, like privileged access management and things like that. So we really, I think it's so important, and that's what you kind of hit on, to look at this as principles that you're applying across the stack, with your identity, your infrastructure, and your data. But it starts with the identity.
Yeah, and I'd like to add on to that too, because you're talking about the complexity of it, and it. What has historically been the case is that organizations focus on the securities of identities. Let's not let the identities get out. Let's make sure that you have a strong password so you're not so easily compromised. Although if you get caught in a phish, you give it away anyway, so it doesn't matter. But that's one aspect of it. And as you said, machine identities are another aspect of it. But an extremely important aspect of it, which has been neglected until recently, is the identity systems themselves. The systems that control, that provide the access control, that provide the gates, as it were, to the applications based on the identities. If you compromise the identity system, the game is over for all of it. You could compromise individual identities, but if you compromise the identity system, you can be anybody.
Yeah, that's so true and so scary, right? And one of the things too, and I know we're going to kind of get into this, right, is there's in cyber incident recovery, there is a surge of discussion around rapid recovery from an infrastructure perspective and vaulting and all of these other ideas, right? In my experience, and I know this is very much where Semperis is kind of rooted as well, even with the clean backups, when we go to get back up, we're waiting on management councils and a clean AD to begin that process. And in most of the investigations that I've seen, that I've gone through where there's ransomware or something like that, it's not just finding the clean backup, it's finding the clean one of AD and then also restoring it to a healthy state to be able to get in and start managing things and then actually bring things online where they can, operationally continue in the first place. And I think that recovery time capability is not talked about, even though it's one of the most fraught with, it's fraught with issues, right? And
Absolutely.
so it's interesting to me, right? Because we can know how far along, how far it is back that our data might have been restored. Maybe I have a recovery point objective of an hour. Maybe I can recover the system from the backup in a couple of hours. But once it's all there, your capability to actually continue goes way beyond that. And I think that for whatever reason, now we're getting into this part of the discussion because everything happens so fast, right?
Yeah, I mean there are layers of complexity to a compromised identity system, a compromised Active Directory, and Entra ID as a result of a cyber attack. And I sort of break it down in a few ways. The first is in a cyber attack, and let's say you know that Active Directory has been compromised in some way. Maybe you have one or two or three domain controllers are encrypted, or maybe you see that there has been activity in Active Directory, maybe people kicked out of administrative groups, new users added to administrative groups, unusual activity. So what that immediately means is a couple of things. One, you can't trust your domain controllers anymore, the servers that host Active Directory, because there could be malware on it. There very likely is malware on it because that is an immediate attack target, is to access the Active Directory database, exfiltrate the database, crack the passwords, and establish persistence in Active Directory so that as the organizations perform incident response, the threat actors can stay in there and stay in hiding in there. So first, you've got malware on the domain controllers, and this is really, you treat a domain controller as an endpoint. How do we get the malware off the domain controller? Do we know how long it's been sitting on there? Do we go back to backups? And how far back do we go with conventional backups? Because the conventional backups back up the whole operating system, which means they back up all the malware. How far back do we go that we know that is malware free? Dwell time is anywhere, you read it, it's anywhere from a few hours to, well, IBM says 200 days. And the reality is Active Directory backups are not much good to you after about 2 weeks. And we don't need to dive into the whys and wherefores of that right now, but suffice it to say, there are so many changes going on in Active Directory. If you bring Active Directory that's a few, 3 or 4 weeks old, it stays broken in fundamental ways that's very difficult to recover from. But that's one. Let's say you do manage to bring it back. You manage to recover one or two domain controllers, and then you have to go and rebuild all of your other domain controllers. All of this is taking time while everybody's running around with their hair on fire. Okay, great. You managed to rebuild a core subset of your Active Directory environment. Maybe you've got 5, 10, 15 domain controllers, and you get 5 back or 3 or 5 back, some fundamental capability. Well, then the problem is you still can't trust the Active Directory that you brought back because you don't know what the threat actor has done inside the service itself. how have they established persistence? And this is one of the things I've been fortunate to talk to a fair number of incident response individuals, consultants, and persistence is one of the common threads through this. The threat actors come in and they insert some kind of a backdoor or some kind of a subtle change in
Yep.
persistence to come back. So you could bring AD back, but you don't know it's going to come back. You don't know when they're going to come back. So to
Yeah,
make it
and
trustworthy takes forever.
yeah, and the reinfection rate, man, because
Right,
like people trust on, oh, well, my backup solution saw that things started getting encrypted at this time. Yeah, but that could have been a logic bomb, like you're saying. They're sitting on this thing for a few months, and then all they got to do is detonate the bomb again.
right.
So it's really, that back door usually is somewhere in the identity, you know, deep down, it's really sad to see organizations go through weeks of things like that and then just to get hit again, right, because of something like this. So that's huge. And one of the things that I find very interesting with your organization too is that you're acting as kind of a community to help folks get awareness and then also kind of get um, the picture of where they're at in their own journey. In the Semperis community, there's not only your products that protect and recover, but you also have a community for assessment with Purple Knight, and then also with Forest Druid. Could you talk a little bit about that and how
Sure.
organizations can use that?
One of the big challenges that organizations face is that their Active Directory has been around for a long time. If you got into this early on, your Active Directory could be literally almost a quarter of a century old. And you can imagine the amount of changes that have happened in a quarter of a century of in production, of what I call many years of harried choices. Well, you could make this perfectly secure, but you've got to get on to the next task. And you take that and multiply that by 24 years. And so what happens is most organizations have tons of vulnerability in their Active Directory environment, and they don't know what they are. So to your point, Purple Knight is a free community tool that performs an assessment of Active Directory, Entra ID, and Okta, if you have it, uh, for vulnerabilities. Well-known vulnerabilities, not so well-known vulnerabilities, on the order of 150 of them. So this is, as I say, it's a free tool. It gives you a point-in-time security assessment. It tells you where your vulnerabilities are. It orders them by priority and criticality, shows where they are in the MITRE attack framework, and gives you steps on how to remediate those vulnerabilities to make your organization more secure. You may not make it perfectly, but the more secure you can make your organization, threat actors, specifically cybercrime actors, they're in it for the money to make as much money as they can as quickly as they can. So if they gain initial access into your organization, maybe they bought a set of credentials for $400 or $500 from an access broker, and they go in and your Active Directory is actually relatively secure, if they find it's going to take more time than they expected to extract the data, and then what's happening is, of course, is it's becoming more expensive for them. The possibility is they go on to the next
Yeah,
victim because
you got to
there's so many.
feed the deterrent, right?
Right,
Oh, this house has the ADT sign in it. I'm going to try the next one that doesn't, and I don't see any ring in their doorbell.
right,
That's that
right,
type of mentality, and it's funny. That's really true. It's just like cameras, even if they're not connected. Usually, when you
right,
need them and they're not connected, it's a problem. But the fact that they're there, certainly has an effect, right?
right, right. And so Forest Druid is a more sophisticated tool and a little more complicated tool to work with. And what it does is attack path analysis, but it's specifically attack path analysis into Active Directory, but it does it from the inside out. So instead of analyzing your entire environment, instead of trying to boil the ocean, as it were, it looks and help once you have defined what your tier 0 administrative access is for Active Directory, and that besides domain controllers, that can be containers that have privileged accounts, or it could be
Mhm.
servers like Entra ID Connect that does synchronization up to Entra ID. Once you have that tier 0 perimeter defined, Forest Druid will go out and find the paths into that tier 0, which is how you may find you have a jump server that has access to tier 0, or you have a group policy that has control over your domain controllers, and therefore the users that have control over that group policy have control over the domain controllers to help you secure your perimeter. So those are completely free community tools. We don't see anything. We don't see the results. I'm not sure about Forest Druid, but we have, I think the last count is around 25,000 organizations have downloaded Purple Knight.
Yeah, and obviously I use the tool actively and I love it.
Right.
There could be things as simple as your users adding a bunch of apps in without consent to your tenant and just
Right.
moving to why, yes or no, and that'd be nice, right? So like you
Right.
said, get a few of those quick wins, man. It could be a couple quick changes. Obviously, you need to know what you're doing for a larger strategy and all of that, and use a consultant and a professional, but it's nice to see where you're at, because I think everyone's had a vulnerability assessment, but not necessarily an identity assessment.
Well, and people they ask the question, well, what about Entra ID? I thought Entra ID was secure. And my answer is yes-ish, because the defaults are not necessarily the most secure. And you just mentioned one. You talked about getting approval for applications. Out of the box, approval wasn't required for adding applications to the tenant, but it's a simple step you can take, especially and Purple Knight will point that out to help secure your organization.
Yeah, no doubt. One other thing I'd like to talk about real quick, right? We talk about hybrid, and obviously there's a big difference between traditional Active Directory, Entra ID, and the intermingling of the two.
Mm-hmm.
One of the questions I get from a lot of folks is like, we have guys that are comfortable with AD, we have some people that are comfortable with Entra, but there's that blind spot kind of in between where maybe the policies aren't in parity, or maybe I'm missing something. Could
Mm-hmm.
you maybe share with the viewers a couple of those areas that are just distinctly problematic?
Well, it's interesting you should mention that because I've encountered plenty of times in organizations where the administration of on-prem Active Directory and in the cloud Entra ID are different. They're different organizations. One
Right.
particularly large because they came up differently, and actually in more than a few organizations, you have the infrastructure team for Active Directory, but for Entra ID, it may actually be the application team because
Yes. Yes.
because they picked up Office 365 and Microsoft pulled the same sleight of hand with Azure Active Directory as was said at the time in Office 365 as they did with Active Directory and Exchange. Oh, we want Exchange. Okay, well, you have to have Active Directory. And oh, we want Office 365. Well, guess what? You're going to get a tenant in Azure Active Directory, Entra ID, at the same time. Whoa, I didn't know that. So you have the organizational aspect to it. The other aspect to it is with Entra ID, and this is a big deal, and we're spending a lot of time evangelizing this, is that in Entra ID, people like to think that, well, Microsoft's got it, it's a SaaS application, they've got my back, it's all taken care of. The reality is it is not taken care of. Your data is not protected in Entra ID. You can actually go and look at the shared responsibility webpage on the Microsoft site for what is and what isn't responsible for Entra ID. And what it turns out is that you are essentially responsible for your data in Entra ID. There is a very, very narrow area. Users, Office 365 groups, and applications that if they are deleted, they are soft deleted and recoverable for 30 days. Everything else is not recoverable. So if you go up and you delete an Entra ID security group, or you delete a conditional access policy, or you screw up a role, guess what? You can't recover them. It's up to you to recover them. So we've really been, I very few organizations were originally aware of this. There are some utilities that you can use from Microsoft, free utilities to export data, but not all of it is protected. So I strongly urge anyone listening to this to go out and look at that shared responsibility model and look at what not is being protected and work on. There are several free utilities and there are commercial utilities. Semperis markets the utility to back up Entra ID data as well. But whatever you do, go off and start backing up your data as best you can. And in some instances, that may be taking screenshots of some of your configurations in case they're deleted.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot to consider. I guess in your experience too, especially recently with all the changes and the increases in the attacks and more identity cleverness, right? AI, all these other things. Where do you see the maturity model of kind of hybrid AD going over the next few years, even in your own opinion, even if it's just kind of a stab in the dark? Where do you think it's going to end up? Because as you said, right, we've had traditional AD without identity assurance or MFA built in, or basically on-prem SSO with Kerberos, right? We've had this forever.
Right. Yeah, we have, I've always, ever since really Azure AD, when it came out and it matured, Microsoft used to have this, they called it a one AD, where it was, the two together. And
Right.
And it's so complicated now because, and I didn't bring this up before, but in case of, we're talking the complexities of Active Directory recovery, there's another complexity, which is when you recover Active Directory on-prem, it falls out of sync with what you have in Entra ID. And stitching those two back together is very complicated and frankly beyond the skill set of most common AD practitioners today. But this holistic hybrid AD, I think we pretty well know that Microsoft is charged into the cloud and sort of left on-prem identity behind. But the reality is, and every once in a while when I do a webinar, we'll hold a poll, and the general response that I get back is that about 75% of organizations don't see themselves ever getting off of Active Directory. Now, and this is a shameless plug for the Hybrid Identity Protection Conference, as you can see in my background, I just happen to have, which is taking place in New Orleans on November 12th and 13th. I just did my podcast about this with Joe Kaplan of Accenture, 750,000 users in Accenture, and they are working their way towards being entirely in the cloud. That's extraordinary. Most organizations, as long as you've got on-premises applications that depend on Active Directory and they work and they make your company money and they're paid for, protect them as best you can, but why get rid of them? So where's it going? I will be retired. Well, the analogy I like to use is when I was getting started, and as I said, I've been around for a long time, client server was a new thing. And honest to God, mainframe was still the main thing. That shows how old I am. But the reality is mainframes are still around decades later. And there was far more penetration of Active Directory and client server around the world than there ever was of mainframe. So Active Directory is not going anywhere for the foreseeable future. You just have to secure it. You just have to be better at securing it and making it, it may not be perfect, but there's a lot most organizations can do for basic hygiene to make it a much tougher nut to crack for the cybercrime actors.
That's awesome. Sean, thank you so much because I know we're at time. Thank you for hanging out and having this discussion. I do want to say for the listeners, Imbalance and Semperis can offer a joint hybrid AD assessment, right? And modernization motion. So if you reach out to us at imbalanceit.com, semperis.com, you can check out some of the tools and things that we've been talking about here. And we'd be happy to advise you on your journey, identities and beyond. But sounds like we start here.
That's right. That's right. Go look at your identities because they're foundational to pretty much everything else you're doing in security nowadays.
No doubt. Thank you, sir, for your time.
You
Thanks,
bet.
everybody
Thanks, Ryan.
out there for listening.
Nice chatting.
In Balance IT Solutions wants to thank you for listening and invite you to join us for the next episode in our podcast series. Remember, In Balance IT Solutions can help you transform your business's technology, and we welcome you to reach out to us for more information on our website at inbalanceit.com. See you on the next one.